Up next on Real America, we continue our look back at the 1968 presidential campaign. Former Alabama Governor George Wallace ran as the nominee of the American Independent Party. On July 21st, he appeared on CBS's Face the Nation. The self-proclaimed law and order candidate discusses his chances of winning, what he sees as the failures and hypocrisy of the two major parties, and his views on segregation, urban riots, and the Vietnam War.
Governor Wallace, is your real ambition to win the presidency, or is it to get enough votes to dictate who does go to the White House?
My real purpose in running for the presidency is to win, and to win outright on November 5th. And I think if you'll follow me around in the country and see the reception we're getting from one end of the country to the other, you can see that we have an excellent chance of winning the election on November 5th at the polls.
From CBS Washington, in color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview with George Wallace, former governor of Alabama and presidential candidate of the American Independent Party. Governor Wallace will be questioned by CBS News correspondent Nelson Benton, Joseph Kraft, syndicated columnist of Publishers Hall, and CBS News correspondent Martin Agronsky. We shall resume the interview with Governor Wallace in a moment.
Governor, despite your own optimism about your chances, every poll, every indicator of national opinion shows that you yourself have no hope to win to the presidency. Your critics contend, therefore, that you're deliberately adopting the role of spoiler, that is, trying to throw the election into the House of Representatives. How would you answer that analysis?
Well, at least, Mr. Agronsky, we have critics, and they're paying attention to our movement. As you've noticed in the papers in the last number of days, members of both parties have said we must join together to stop this movement headed by George Wallace. Of course, George Wallace is one individual, but I am speaking for many millions of people in our country. I might say that there are many polls that I win. Radio and television polls all the way from New Bedford, Massachusetts, Syracuse, New York, all the way to Honolulu. I have won on television and radio. Now, the other polls that you're talking about show that we have doubled our strength since April of last year, I believe. And we're just now getting into the campaign. And if you will follow me around the country, you will see that we are having larger crowds than even the candidates for the two other existing major parties. As witness our trip to Ohio yesterday, we had larger crowds than those who came out to witness the arrival of candidates for one of the party Republican or Democratic nomination.
Governor
we
Wallace,
can win the election, and that's the purpose of running. It's not to spoil anything, but to spoil, other than to spoil the chances of the Republican and the Democratic Party, which, that is, both of them, neither of them are giving the American people a choice.
Governor Wallace, you just said you thought you could win. Could you
Yes,
indicate the states where you think you're going to win?
I think we're going to win every one of the southern and border states, from Missouri around through Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up into the free state of Maryland. And we have an excellent chance in states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, California, Michigan. We have an excellent chance in states like Nebraska and Connecticut and New England. In fact, we are running well in all of the states, even in the western states. But I think we're going to win the southern and border states, and we're going to win several of the states in the Midwest, and a good chance to win California. We also have an excellent chance in New York, whether some people believe it or not. In fact, we've received more mail probably from the state of New York than any state in the Union.
Governor Wallace, are there any conditions now under which you would withdraw from the race before November? Could platform changes cause you to withdraw?
There are no conditions under which I would withdraw from the race for the presidency. I said back last year when I was trying to get on the ballot in California under their most difficult law that this ought to be a lesson to one of the two national parties. They ought to give the American people a choice of not only platform but candidate. But since that time, not only have they not given the American people a choice, but both party leaderships joined together in the passage of the so-called fair housing law, which is really the greatest attack on private property in the history of our country. And every aspirant for the Republican and Democratic nomination, along with the leaders of both parties in Congress, joined together to pass this anti-property ownership law. And in my judgment, if a platform was given to the American people by one of the parties that suited me, it would have to be a 180-degree turn from the present position of the leadership of the two parties.
But, Governor, in your speeches just as recent as this past week, you have occasionally said, and this is not an exact quote, but this is the gist of it, regardless of what happens in November, we're going to change some trends.
Yes, yes, I'm saying that. I say that right now. I say that the fact that we are having the largest crowds, we are having tumultuous support for our attitude and philosophy throughout the country, is today making the leadership of both national parties sit down and think. It's making members of the Congress wonder whether we've been voting right, whether or not we must change our position. And so this movement is going to help change trends in the country.
Well, aren't we
and
talking
that is
then
the
about
least...
spoiling then, Governor?
Sir?
Aren't you talking then about possible spoiling, about the fact that you probably can't win?
Change in trends is not going to spoil anything. It's going to help correct things.
Governor.
And that's exactly what we're in the race for, is to change directions in our country, because neither one of the two national parties are giving the people a choice,
Governor,
in change of directions.
Governor, may I quote to you an observation that you made yourself last February when you contended that your campaign role could be that of a spoiler?
Who said that?
This was in the New York Times on February the 8th when you were quoted as having said that.
Yes, sir.
And then you said...
That I said that?
That you said that.
Well, I don't exactly know where exactly all the exact quotes that I made on at press conferences and the context in which that statement was made.
Well, it
but
was
the New
here
York
in Washington, sir.
But let me say this, that yes, I'm in the race to spoil, but not to spoil in the sense that you're talking about, is to spoil the chances of both national parties electing a president.
Well, let's try
and
this.
that's, of course, what we are doing. And I can
Governor.
say this, and anybody who votes for the National Republican or National Democratic Party will be throwing their vote away if they think like we do, because you certainly
Governor.
don't have a choice there.
Governor, let's try it this way. You also said at that time, again according to the New York Times, that if the election is thrown into the House, we, that is you, have all to gain and nothing to lose. And you implied then that that kind of a deadlock might well force important concessions from the presidential candidate, whose electoral vote combined with yours would add up to
Yes.
the required 270. Now, if you were thinking along those lines then, has your thinking changed?
Mr. Gronsky, the context in which that statement was made came
Yes.
about as a result of a question from a member of the press in the audience.
Right.
I have never voluntarily said we're going to throw it into the House, and that's our purpose. But the question is asked by members of the press, if, Governor Wallace, the hypothetical question and speculative question, if neither one of the two parties get a majority, what would be your position?
I see.
Well, I always answer the hypothetical question by saying, well, of course, if that happened, and there always is that probability when there are three or more running, because it only takes the plurality of the vote to win, but if you don't get a plurality of the popular vote, which gives you a majority of the electoral vote, then it would wind up in the House, unless it was settled in the Electoral College. And I might remind you that the Electoral College meets first, and therein would lie probably the solution, that is, the election of the president. But I might well be number one in the Electoral College instead of number three. But anyway, what I was trying to say when we said we have everything to gain and nothing to lose is that if I were not a candidate for the presidency, one of the two major national parties in existence now would win the election, and they are Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Okay.
So
Well, Governor-
my running
Yeah.
for the presidency, and even if I did not win,
Yes.
we would be in no worse position than we would have been had I not run. So we have everything to gain and nothing to lose.
Okay, Governor, let's ask another hypothetical question, again based on the premise that if you were to win to the presidency, what would you do about riots?
What would I do about riots? The first thing that I would say as a president is I give my moral support to the police and firemen in this country. And the first thing I would do if a continuation of the breakdown of law and order exists in the District of Columbia, where we are talking today, where just today pictures of people murdered in the streets I would use the office of the presidency in view of the fact that this is the district to restore order in the District of Columbia. If I had to call federal troops into this city, and I would give my moral support to the police in the country, I would ask the Congress to pass legislation that did away with decisions of the courts that handcuffed the police, and I would just say we're going to have law and order. And when I said that, and my election would indicate to people in the large, the politicians and leaders of the large cities of our country especially, that the people of our country are sick and tired of the breakdown of law and order, and they in turn then, in my judgment, would tell the police enforce the law. And in my judgment, an enforcement of the law
Governor,
would bring about a restoration of law and order in this country without the expenditure of billions of dollars as proposed by some of the social engineers.
you were quoted as having observed once that the people know the way to stop a riot is to hit someone on the head.
Yes, sir, I've said something similar to that. When somebody goes out and begins to loot and burn a building down, which endangers the health and safety of everybody, that's a good way to stop it. If you let the police knock somebody in the head who was breaking a plate glass window, or who was assaulting a policeman, who was assaulting a person on the street, or throwing a firebomb, I think they'd be getting out mighty light if somebody knocked them in the head. And frankly, that's exactly what ought to be done. And if I were the President of the United States, I would take whatever was necessary to prevent what happened in this city if we had to order the knocking in the head of many people. And when you do that, you're going to satisfy the overwhelming majority of people of all races in this country, because it's not a matter of race, it's a matter of anarchists, and the government has kowtowed to every anarchist group in the United States, and as a consequence, we don't have any safety in the streets of our large cities, nor right here in Washington, D.C.
Governor, you've talked about these trends and reversing the trends, but there are a lot of people who are against these trends, who feel that the result of your actions and the result of the things you say is to speed up and accelerate these trends. Senator Sam Ervin, for example, called you, Governor, the chief aider and abettor of these civil rights laws you pretend to be against. And his argument was that the kinds of things you were doing...
He said that 4 years ago.
That's right.
You're quoting something that Senator Ervin said 4 years ago. He hadn't said that lately, has he?
I have a quote from 4 years ago. But what do you think,
you have
what do
a
you
quote
think
4
about
years
that
ago,
principle?
so I would like to ask you to ask Senator Ervin, and of course he has a right to his opinion. I think he's a fine man. But don't tell me that I am responsible for what happened in Los Angeles and what happened in Detroit. I wasn't there. I am not the chief aider and abettor to the breakdown of law and order or civil rights programs, anything of that sort. In fact, in Alabama, contrary to what you might know, we didn't have any breakdown of law and order in that state. We had some demonstrations.
No breakdown of law and order in Birmingham?
No, sir. What breakdown of law and order came there? We had some demonstrations that put some water on some people and arrested some folk. Did they burn the city down?
What happened after the Selma disturbances?
The Selma march, one woman was shot on the highway by some thugs. People are shot in Washington every day and in Philadelphia every day. But nobody got hurt in the march, and we had 35...
Governor, may I interrupt
We had
you?
35,000 people.
Governor, now you cannot say that no one got hurt in the march.
Eight people got hit in the head at
I'm
the
talking
Selma
about
Bridge.
the March 7th march, Governor, and
How
your
many-
state patrolman...
Who got hurt?
Well, I would estimate conservatively that at least 15 were hurt in that march.
15 out of 35,000. Did one of them have to go to the hospital?
Yes, sir.
One, how many?
Well, we're
how
talking
many?
about 5 years ago.
One person went to the hospital. 8 got hurt at the Selma Bridge. Not a single person got killed involved in the march. And then the next week, 50 are killed in Detroit. 50 are killed in Los Angeles. And a few people got their heads skint in Selma when there were 35,000 people there. And you call that the breakdown of law and order. While right here in Washington, D.C., people got killed, hundreds and thousands got injured. And yet, when you talk on these programs, you talk about Selma. And you say 15. Well, let's take your word for it. 15 got hurt. In 6 weeks of marching in Selma, 15 got hurt. While in Washington here the other day, over 1,000 got injured in one day. And so the breakdown of law and order certainly hasn't been in Alabama. It's been in Washington, it's been in Detroit, it's been in New Haven, it's been in other places outside of Alabama. I'd be glad to take your figures. 15 were hurt.
I'm talking about one day, Governor. We can go further into the
well, there wasn't
the
a single
Reeb
person
killing.
killed in the march.
Well, there were other killings during that series
Well,
of
other
events.
killings, there was
Governor.
one that took place after it was over, when it was under the complete jurisdiction of the federal government, not under the jurisdiction of the state. Federal troops were involved, and one person was killed on the highway, which was very tragic. But now compare that one person with how many was killed in Washington, how many were killed in Detroit, how many were killed in Los Angeles. So, comparatively speaking, we've had peace, and it's generally accepted in the press that we've had peace in the South
I think you're
compared to
missing
what
the
you have
point
in
that
other
I'm
parts of the
trying to
country.
make, and which I think Senator Ervin was trying to make. His point was that that what followed after that was civil rights laws.
Let me say this. You go
Isn't
and
that
ask,
true, that what followed after those
you're
things was
quoting
civil rights
Senator
laws?
Ervin 4 years ago. In fact, over 4 years ago, going on 5 years ago.
Is it right or is it wrong that what followed after
No, sir.
64 and 65 were civil
No,
rights
sir.
laws?
Well, every time that somebody wants a law passed, they go out and do something. Now, we had Martin Luther King tragically assassinated, and they use that as an excuse to pass the anti-property law, so-called open housing. So what followed after that? So you see, there's always somebody can say that some reason exists for the passage of some law. But I can say to you that if I become the president, we're going to maintain law and order in the nation's capital, and when we do that, it's going to be a good moral support for law and order throughout the United States, where
Governor,
women can walk the streets,
Governor,
where people can go to work, where people can ride the subways and the transit systems of our country.
Governor, you've repeatedly objected to being called a racist.
Yes, sir.
You don't regard yourself as a racist.
No, sir, I don't regard myself as a racist, and I think the biggest racists in the world are those who call other folks racist.
Okay.
I think the biggest bigots in the world are those who call other folks bigots.
All
And
right,
let me
sir.
point out, my wife got more Negro vote in the general election for governor of Alabama 2 years ago than either one of her two opponents, and she got nearly all of them at Selma. So I would say that Negro citizens would not have voted for my wife in Alabama if the mass of Negro citizens had considered me a racist or my wife a racist.
Governor, when you were inaugurated, you made a very famous observation. You said in your inaugural
Segregation,
address,
yes, sir.
today,
Yes, sir.
segregation tomorrow,
That's right.
segregation forever.
I
What
said
did
that within
mean?
the context of Alabama's public school system. And I again say that when I said that, I was honest. And when I come to Washington, D.C., and I see all of these folks who talk one way but move to Virginia and Maryland, when I see all these bridges built across the Potomac River to help expedite the rush away from this city of the liberals.
What
who go,
bridges, Governor?
Oh, these big bridges that got across
They've been
the
here
Potomac
quite a
River.
while.
Well, I'm being facetious about that, but you sure got a lot of them because you got to expedite the rush of people away from the nation's capital. Only 6 members of the Congress out of 535 got their children in the public schools in Washington. And all these pseudo-liberals and intellectuals here who are hypocrites have moved away
Let's
from
leave them
Washington
aside,
and-
Governor, and address this question to yourself. What do you mean when you say segregation within the context
I
of the
meant that
public
in the
school
public
system? You mean
school system-
separation of the races,
No,
do you
sir.
not?
No, sir.
What do you mean?
You see, segregation, you don't understand, Mr. Gronsky, yourself,
Okay.
evidently. There's been more mingling, more mixing, and more association and togetherness of the races in Alabama than there has been in New York from, I believe, whence you come, or in Washington, D.C. But we did have a social separation in the school system because the school systems of the rural South were the social center. So we just quite candidly and honestly said, we'll have a separate school system. And we were honest about it. And we think
Well,
that
no one doubts your honesty in saying you wanted
No,
a separate school
what I'm
system.
talking-
I'm
I'm-
talking about the meaning of separation and segregation.
I'm trying to play up the hypocrisy of folks in other parts of the country and in the nation's capital who say we for integration.
I'm not relating them to anybody else.
Well, I'm
talking
relating
about
them.
your position.
I'm relating
If you were
them, though.
president,
Well,
what
could-
would you do
Oh,
about
I wouldn't
segregation?
advocate segregation and if I were president. I could care less what the people of Alabama, California do in their school system. I would only say you run your schools yourself. But we're not going to use federal money to bus children in Chicago from one neighborhood to the other. If you want to do it in Chicago or St. Louis or Philadelphia, you do it. I wouldn't advocate segregation of anything. I would advocate only that these domestic institutions be run by the people in Philadelphia and in St. Louis and in Los Angeles, and they could then have the type school system they
Yes, but
wanted.
we have federal laws, Governor, that apply to all the nation, not to Philadelphia or Los Angeles.
That's what I'm
or St.
arguing, is
Louis.
that federal...
Well, what would you do about the laws that
we
exist?
don't have any laws that go as far as HEW guidelines. The guidelines today transcend even the civil rights law. We'll obey the law, whatever the law happens to be, but the law of this country does not say that you've got to transport little children from one neighborhood to the another. In fact, the civil rights law expressly prohibits that. Yet HEW is going beyond what the law says, and I would stop that. And I would ask the Congress to change some of the laws that have taken over the public school systems of New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and turn them back to the people there. I don't want any separate black and white in the country in the sense of separatism you're talking about.
Why do you advocate it?
Well, I haven't advocated it, Mr. Gronsky, not at all. I haven't advocated that at all.
Governor,
we have more togetherness in Alabama than you have in Washington, D.C. This is a segregated city here because of the hypocrites that moved out.
Governor, can I switch you to another subject?
This is the hypocrite capital of the world.
Well, Governor, you've said that you thought you had a chance to be president, and I think maybe we ought to address ourselves to some of the questions that a president would have to deal with. What would be your approach to the problem of the nuclear arms race, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance?
Well, of course, I hope and pray that the step in the non-dissemination of nuclear information is honest.
Not information, is it?
Well, I mean, not information, but the weapons themselves. That's an honest effort on the part of the major powers who must sign, of course, the treaty, and 40 other countries.
Would you be in favor of signing it?
I would be in favor of that step provided we had adequate inspection programs and adequate safeguards to see that the treaty was not violated.
Does the treaty satisfy you as it is now?
The what?
Does the treaty satisfy you as it's written now?
Well, I'm not exactly sure whether it satisfies me or not, but I would say this, that it is a step in the direction of some dialogue, as we like to say, between the great powers and the great nuclear powers, and the matter of the giving of atomic nuclear weapons to other countries, and to prohibit that is good, provided we have adequate safeguards.
Do you think the safeguards are adequate in the treaty?
I'm not sure whether they are or not. I'm just not sure.
Governor,
if they are adequate, then that's one thing, and if they aren't adequate, it's another. I don't, and of course we understand that under that treaty, any nation can withdraw within a certain notice to the other signatories, and which really means that it's not all that binding. But I am for doing something real and concrete in the matter of the spread of nuclear weapons if we can have adequate safeguards insofar as protecting the national interest of the United States.
On the matter of Vietnam, Governor, around the campaign trail, people who support you say they like your stand on Vietnam. Yet your stand is rather simple. Could you say just how we should solve that, which is certainly one of the great issues?
Well, I've said in my speeches, you know, Mr. Benton, there's no simple solution, that I don't impugn the motives of those in the top echelons of our government because it's an exasperating experience. I do say again that we should have not gotten in by ourselves, that we should have had a long talk with our Western European allies and non-communist Asian allies and insisted they help us in some manner because we've helped them so much with our money and our nuclear shield, but that's water over the dam, and we are in Vietnam, whether we like it or not. So, whatever we do should be in the interest of those who are there. I pray the Paris peace talks are successful, that once they get beyond the propaganda stage, that we can have an honorable peace through political and diplomatic negotiations. But if this fails, then there's only one conclusion to rely upon, or one method to rely upon, and that's the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And if they thought that the war could be concluded militarily with conventional weapons, that's what I would support, and then bring the American servicemen home.
Well, let's take this step by step, sir. Right now we're in Paris.
That's right.
You have not mentioned, I don't think, as other candidates have, whether or not this country should insist on some sort of recognition of the National Liberation Front. How do you feel about
Well,
that?
I think that maybe the sad experience in Laos and other places where you have had coalition government in which the Viet Cong or the communist terrorists involved, that you lay the groundwork for the real takeover of the country by the communists. At the moment, and I think I would be even later, I am against a terrorist group, the Viet Cong and the National Liberation Front, being involved in the government through negotiations, that is, by giving them a place in the government. I don't think they deserve to be in the government, and I think that if you let them be represented in the peace talks and set up a government with them having an equal voice, or a voice with the other groups in South Vietnam, you are really setting the basis for a takeover of the Viet Cong of the government of South Vietnam.
Do you see any hope for a political settlement without any recognition of the NLF?
I don't know exactly whether, I couldn't tell you. I just don't know it. I don't think the president knows, and I don't think that the Republicans know. I think we're going to have to wait and see what comes out of the Paris peace talks. We can pray about it and we can hope about it, but if they do not get a settlement, honorable settlement from the Paris peace talks, in my judgment, we ought to lean on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and have a military conclusion to the war in Southeast Asia and bring the American servicemen home.
Governor.
And also, we should stop these folks in this country from advocating communist victory and building the morale of the communists. I'm tired of our children and grandchildren.
Stop them how, Governor?
Stop them how? By indicting a professor who makes a speech calling for communist victory, and it's printed in the communist world. That aids the communists. By a man who raises money, blood, and clothes for the communists on a college campus and flies a Viet Cong flag. That's not dissent. That's treason. You have a right to say, let's get out of the war. We don't want to be in the war, but you don't have a right to call for communist victory, and the average man on the street's sick and tired of it.
Governor, I regret we have run out of time. Thank you very much for being here to Face the Nation.
Yes, Martin.
Today on Face the Nation, George Wallace, former governor of Alabama and presidential candidate of the American Independent Party, was interviewed by CBS News correspondent Nelson Benton. Joseph Kraft, syndicated columnist of Publishers Hall. CBS News correspondent Martin Nagronsky led the questioning. Face the Nation originated in color from CBS Washington.
Sunday on